Mieke Bal es una persona de sobra conocida, pero a mí me gustaría ofrecer hoy una imagen de su trabajo con el tiempo transcurrido de una trayectoria larga y tremendamente lúcida en este momento, de Mieke Bal como una persona que ha construido una intelectual, una de las más brillantes intelectuales del cambio de siglo XX-XXI, que ha construido un espacio académico, un espacio transdisciplinar, donde la teoría de la narrativa, la narratología, la semiótica en su momento, la crítica cultural, el feminismo, los estudios visuales y también en los últimos años, a través de su trabajo audiovisual, los Migration Studies, podríamos decir, dentro del ámbito de los Cultural Studies. En todas esas líneas, Mieke Bal ha construido una encrucijada, a crossroads, una encrucijada intelectual, una encrucijada académica, que desde la fundación del Instituto de Análisis Cultural en Ámsterdam, ASCA, con todos sus discípulos y sus colegas, trabajando en este método que ella llamó de análisis cultural, a partir de la idea del concepto viajero, ¿no? Los traveling concepts, que es uno de sus libros más influyentes. Mieke Bal nos ha regalado una casa para pensar, una casa para pensar en la literatura, una casa para pensar en las artes plásticas, su trabajo sobre pintura, Quoting Caravaggio, Reading Rembrandt, son libros fundamentales en la historia de la crítica visual sobre la pintura. Y en los últimos 15 años, quizás algo más, ella ha decidido dar un salto para mostrar que hay que pensar sobre la cultura y pensar sobre el arte creando arte. Es decir, construir un movimiento práctico del pensamiento teórico al mismo tiempo que se está escribiendo ensayo, al mismo tiempo que se está filmando un documental, ¿no? Esta es una reivindicación, creo, muy importante. La Universidad Europea y la Universidad Española están empezando a reaccionar también, y en nuestro equipo tenemos algunos ejemplos de ello, de que enseñar literatura, enseñar periodismo, enseñar arte, enseñar cine, tiene en algún momento también la invitación y la provocación de hacer literatura, de hacer cine, de hacer teatro y de construir pensando en un territorio que es común a la creación y a la especulación. Yo quería leer muy brevemente también un fragmento que encontramos en su página web, donde ella define de alguna manera, a propósito de una edición de Semiotics of Narrative, esta trayectoria y este viaje, ¿no? Dice lo siguiente, cito en inglés. I have always been interested in the narrative aspect of social cultural life, because narrative is, in my view, the most influential, important cultural mode. Narrative was my first intellectual passion, and it still is foremost in my mind when I look at artifacts or methods of analysis. I started out as a literary scholar, but retrospectively, I noticed at some point early on how much of my work was in fact engaging with visuality. Even my purely literary studies developed around the issue of focalization, an eminent bridge between the literary and the visual. I never saw this as strange. I didn't even think that this concept had anything to do with the boundaries of narrative. I have a repulsion for boundaries, separations between domains that seem arbitrary to me. I always wanted to look around the corner of what I knew. As soon as I knew how to do something, I wanted to move on and explore unknown territories. At the same time, the initial interest never really went away when I began to explore unknown fields. My move from literature to visual art did not entail a change, but an extension. For scholars of the visual, especially art historians, my approach to images bears the traces of those earlier interests. But this means an enrichment, not a distortion of the new field. I think that quotation summarizes very well Mieke Bal's approach. I could be reading for minutes and minutes and minutes her bibliography and her contributions to our fields and to documentary creativity. I just want to call your attention about at least one new book, which is being prepared to be edited at Murcia University. It's a collection.
It's already
out. And this book is going to be very influential. And I call your attention, particularly to those scholars who are working on their PhD, because that collection of essays, it's going to be extremely inspiring. She's working on the concept of figuration, of how literature can make us look and see, and how literature and verbal art also make us see. You know? I think she has pushed Lyotard's concept of figure much more farther than we could expect it. And I just want to finish thanking you, Mieke, for being with us again. I think you are an inspiration for the elder, for the seniors, for the youngsters, and you are an example of generosity. I think that you share everything you do. You're able to travel around to attend your PhD students all over Europe, no matter how many viruses are around. And this is also an example. I want to defend and I want to congratulate you and thank you for that example that you give us as academic, because without that example, scholarship is doomed. And I think that we owe you this recognition and this little modest homage that we're doing with this presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here again. And this is, I'm so sorry that I have to do this in English, but my Spanish is just not fluent enough. But you can understand that I'm very grateful to Domingo and Maria Jose for their invitation, which makes a more enduring collaboration than a single visit possible. And for me, that's very important. It's not just one visit. I'm now part of this. And ever since my first academic visit in 2004 to Murcia, southern Spain has become a favorite place for me in my life. With many friends, co-thinkers, co-imagers, almost like a big family in the sense of the social, artistic, and academic way. The intelligence and generosity of the Spanish colleagues has been heartwarming and stimulating for me. Now, for today, I have prepared something that will sound like a lecture. And this is also because there are people online following this. But it is important to realize that this is a seminar, a forum for discussion. So I will begin to speak, but please do realize that you can interrupt me at any time, just wave and then you can speak, disagree, ask for clarification. And in fact, I welcome such interruptions wholeheartedly. And if you get interested in some of the references that I mentioned and that you don't manage to copy from the slides, do ask me and I'll list them and send you the full reference by email if you let me know that. Okay, so can we have the next slide, please? Some of the slides have a problem, but okay, this is just the content of what I want to talk about. First, how it happened, how I got involved in making art, and just a few remarks on my practice. And then I want to say something about the two films you have just seen. And after that, I will go into a little more depth about two aspects of the motivation that drives my work in this combined domain. And the first is the need to theorize and justify the integrated attempt to analyze and frame art and literature historically, but not in a traditional sense of history as linear, with the work of making images. Making images is a way of reframing. The second addresses more specifically, but they cannot be clearly distinguished, what I have termed in the title for this encounter, the ethics and politics of documenting migration. And here the central concept around and through which I theorize this is trauma. And you've heard the word in the second film we've seen. And as an artwork, I will bring in a novel, not just the film that you've just seen. The novel is also a documentary piece. And I want to do this to show that documentary is not specific to a medium. And all through the discussion, the truth claim of documentary remains active in its precarity. It's very precarious, but it is important. That's the difference between documentary and so-called fiction, although they are, of course, related. Now, how it happened. Can I have the next slide, please? Some 20 years ago, in 2002, I began quite suddenly to make documentaries, which was surprising for a stubbornly committed academic that I was. And let me add that I still am. I am not going to do something else. The move to filmmaking has never been a shift, a change of career or of interest, but an attempt to get closer to the contemporary culture in which we live and which I wanted to study and understand. Can we have the next slide? The occasion of my first documentary was rather prosaic. Someone, this guy, something bad has happened to this guy who was my neighbor. And I was upset that this was done in the name of the state of European law, and hence also in my name. So I felt compelled to support him and make sure to document what had happened. Next. The issue was the unfair, unnecessary, and unwarranted persecution of an undocumented migrant, sans papier, in Paris, who had applied for a study visa, and whereas all his mates who had applied for the same got it, it was denied to him for no reason at all. And he was threatened with deportation. So something had to be done, and with the friends, we did something. Now, at age 22 and alone in Europe, this treatment can become easily traumatic. Instead of making a film, the first goal of which would be to produce and distribute knowledge, I wanted quite simply and frankly and a bit naively to bear witness and stand by his side. And this false journalist was another student whom I had been asking to intervene and do something in the municipality of the town where they were trying to prevent him from getting his papers. Now, knowledge, of course, did come into the equation. I wanted people to know what kind of cruelties were committed in our name. And he is saying this, Manu. But this was not because we didn't know. We do know, and we always have, all the time. The request to have this seminar with you today made me think back to that moment in 2002. What happened when I decided to make this film called 1001 jours, 1001 days. And from then on, I wondered why I continued to make documentaries and later fiction films, but these always in a strong bond between the fiction and the reality. I must have had solid reasons, given the difficulty to financing, to gather a crew, to get help with editing, to learn some of the technique that I still don't really master. This takes a lot. Now, retrospectively, I understood that for me, documentary is not only for the transmission of knowledge, but also, and even primarily, to demonstrate attitudes towards the knowledge desired and partly proposed. And this is clear from all documentaries that I see made by others. They are, first of all, passionate. They want you to know. They are informed by passion. And that passion brings directors to the subject and makes them feel obliged to carry the project forward and that is much more complex than the desire to bring knowledge to the spectators. It is a very passionate endeavor. Can we have the next slide? Now here we have Rene Descartes, a much maligned philosopher on whom I have made a fiction film project. He wrote in his latest treatise, The Passions of the Soul, Les Passions de l'âme, in a spirit close to what I mean here. You do something because you want to do it, and your soul, whatever that means today, pushes you so that action of your body occurs. So that separation that they blame him for is bullshit. In spite of the Vulgate that wants Descartes to be guilty of separating mind and body, the dilemma, the disquiets, and the doubts that his writings convey are precisely coming from the opposite direction. He argued so strongly for the independent existence of the soul, equaling today the mind, say, because he didn't think it was easy or even possible. Next slide, please. So his Descartes' soul and mind included, or at least touched, the imagination, the senses, hence the body. If cogito ergo sum, if I'm thinking, there must be some me doing it. So there is a body. Memory and yes, intellect, of course, that participates. Now I can live with such a concept of the soul, even if I don't believe in any of the religious paraphernalia surrounding it. All restrictions to cognition, to use again a contemporary word, an anachronistic word, or intellect would be incompatible with Descartes' vision. Now, I cannot imagine then a documentary has ever been made that is without passion. Now, in my practice of documentary making, I find two aspects, most important of all, but they are in tension with each other because they each serve a different constituency. Let me abbreviate them as modesty and intimacy. Can I have the next? On the one hand, a great degree of modesty is necessary in order to preserve the privacy of the people concerned, to the extent of their wishes. This may go against the director's input to impulse to document as much as possible, and especially things difficult to talk about. When people fall silent, they have their reasons. It is not up to the filmmaker to dig and probe and force. And this is very delicate. People who agree to be subjects, as this horrible word says it, of documentary must have the trust of the director who expects them to tell the truth. But even more importantly, the other way around. They must be able to trust the director. A trust that the latter must earn and deserve and be loyal to. Informed consent only goes so far. They sign a consent form, but then what happens then? Not all such subjects can be totally aware of what may happen to the film in which they appear. And the director owes it to them to make sure no personal limits are being transgressed. And this is the reason why my documentaries are not fully online, not in my website, because I promised them that that would not happen. So the next slide, please. On the other hand, the filmmaker has to count with and on an audience. Why else make a film? For the most propitious chances of the film is in engaging viewers. An intimacy for that is best established between the filmmaker and the people in the film. Now that intimacy promises the viewer that what we see is real because you get so close. Sometimes long stretches of togetherness are necessary to achieve this. And for this first film, I have spent a lot of time with the family and with the main characters. This intimacy may be attained easily, almost naturally, as happened in this case, but it may also be the result of manipulation. Next slide, please. And there is a fine line between these two modes of producing intimacy. The former, ethically acceptable, if it's the result of an establishing relationship, the latter, not at all. Manipulation is not acceptable. Now, the tension inherent in this is that the intimacy is pursued not necessarily for the development of a genuine friendship, even if that can happen, as was the case for this film, but in the interest of the filmmaker's access to an audience. Hence, for the viewer's sake, rather than that of the subjects whose lives are laid bare for viewers they don't know. And this is the delicacy. So you can imagine the delicacy this entails. And so sometimes I have wanted to invite the character for a screening of the film with students in Lyon, for example, so that they could actually meet him and see him and ask questions about the loyalty of the film. So in my process of making, I noticed quickly how important these two concepts, modesty and intimacy, turn out to be. And so in this presentation, I will bring these two concepts up for discussion and the tension between them on the basis of some of my documentary work, but also of some, other issues. And I will start with some remarks on the two films that you have seen. Is this clear so far? And can you hear me? Is this all okay? You just wave if you want to ask a question. Okay, so can we have the next slide? Oh, that's the one that's missing. Okay, I don't know what's happening. Anyway, so here we go, Un trabajo limpio. The short film, A Clean Job, is named for the ambition of that 15-year-old high school student in Murcia, one of those cities where many immigrants arrive, and some to move on and some to stay. Now, is there a next slide? What's the next slide? Because this is fine. Okay. So this young woman, Faiza, is the one who says, I want a, no, she's not the one who says it, that she wants a clean job, but she mentions the modest wish to end up with a job as her ultimate goal. And the video portrays the city through short speeches of its inhabitants and its newcomers. You have heard and seen that. It's all fragmented. So wherever you enter the video, and this was a video made for exhibition, not for a theater screening, wherever you enter, someone will be talking about their everyday life. And the fragmented style of the film is an attempt to be adequate to the lives of the people who have no assurance that they can actually have a life with some continuity. What's the next slide? Yes, okay, that's fine. The second generation school children, the working migrants, the football players, immigrants who are as yet residing illegally, sin papeles, in Spain, and native, and then you also hear native Spaniards, even some anthropologists. Now, the people living the everyday of migratory life, their speeches alternate with the anthropologists are there to show that people are concerned with this. Now, you have probably seen that we don't use capitals. We say Spain with the lowercase, and this is one of the ways of emphasizing the oral quality of these testimonies, the unofficial quality. Now, weaving in and out of spaces and situations, this looped video made for exhibition presents a string of their short statements, and the resulting fabric is not a narrative. You don't get a sense of a narrative in the whole film. There is no linearity. The film is and remains fragmented. It should be seen as a dialogue fabricated by montage, by editing, an alternation of different viewpoints, or the expression of a heterogeneous collective subconscious, because issues come back. I'm curious to know how this film strikes you as inhabitants of the region portrayed, more or less. And when the first installment of the exhibition was shown in the same city where it was filmed, in Murcia, actually in the former chapel, Sara Veronica's, this was next door to the market where a lot of these migrants worked. We recruited some of them there. And so we went to invite a market salesman personally to visit the show. We just went and said, please come and visit and see. And some of them did. Next slide, please. So this is the companion, the compañero, with whom I made this film, the exhibition, and also he participates in the film. So after the beginning with the film that I just talked about, 1001 Jours, 1001 Days, I went on this curatorial project with Miguel in Murcia, and that led to the commission from the regional government to make a documentary about the migratory situation in Murcia, and that led to the film Un trabajo limpio. Then, and ever after, I have been exploring documenting what I call migratory culture. And this term does not refer to the culture of migrants, but to the culture we all share, and in which migration or the movement of people is a normal phenomenon. And that's why you saw these images of crowds in Murcia, all mixed. So bear in mind that I address both the culture we are part of and the fact that the presence of migrants in that culture is normal. In these films, I have pursued an intimacy with the people whose lives are central in the film and often worked with them in the editing. In Mille un Jour, we went back to the family several times, and there was a moment that the mother of the bride said, "Oh, I'm so glad that you show that we are washing the salad." And we had put that image of green salad in the film because it was beautiful in the between two yellow images. but she said, well, because the French think we are dirty. Now, I'm sorry, but the opposite is true. Okay, so we will talk about that later. Next slide. Separations then. That longer film that you saw is constituted a new development in this series of works. I have barely any photos of this project, but since you just saw it, I hope you can bear with me. And the lack of photos is also, in a sense, meaningful. Now here, the co-author of the film is herself a migrant, as you have seen, and the documentary nature of the film is enhanced by an autobiographical aspect. Moreover, it was actually her, the co-author, Andrea, it was her first goal. She wanted to set out to make an autobiographical film. So in the end, with this film, and in line with the contradictory aspect I will keep talking about, I'm offering something impossible, the autobiography of someone else. Contradiction, right? Okay, let's keep that contradiction in view. And this is possible in documentary film, not so easily in writing. Now, we were co-authors on an equal footing, of course. Andrea had moved to Amsterdam, and I had met her through her brother Marcio, a fellow academic on whose behalf she came to pick up some DVDs. He was in Brazil and he asked her to pick up some DVDs. And then we talked about her project and I said, would you like to borrow my camera? Yes. So during this first conversation, she expressed the wish to make a film that, again, contradictorily, would be autobiographical but not self-centered. That's what she said. I don't want to talk about myself, but I want to make an autobiography. How the hell do you do that? Now, for her, that not self-centeredness was the challenge. For me, initially the question was how to involve myself in such an ambiguous project and in the end to disentangle myself from too many subject positions. Andrea wanted to use the opportunity of a family reunion at Christmas in Sao Paulo, Brazil, of her parents and her siblings to make a film on the question, and this is what she started out telling me in the first visit, why her family was so caught up in the foreign, as she called it. She and all her siblings at one time or another had migrated with the intention to stay in the new country. Not all stayed, but they all went. And as we have seen, that other country is the old country, the one of which the mother had been deprived as a child. When Andrea returned after her family Christmas party with the footage, however, it turned out that the material showed a very different thematic than the migratory impulse. While filming, she had not really noticed this shift. Coming in as an outsider, I saw it right away, but that's of course easy because I was not part of it. The film, as you have seen it, untangles these two themes, the foreigners and the past. The primary figure is not Andrea, but her mother, Edith. Hence, the autobiographical aspect is already pushed a little bit aside. And interestingly, this woman, spilling over with emotion and never acting, was awarded the prize for Best Actress in the Film Festival in Sao Paulo for this film. Next slide, please. Now, in 1933, when she was 3 years old, Andrea's mother, Edith, was taken out of her familiar environment in Germany and left with her parents on the last ship allowed to leave Germany with Jewish refugees on it. The very last ship. After that, straight to the camps. After having been rejected by various American cities at which the ship called, they ended up in Brazil. Now, the little girl, Edith, out of her depth linguistically, was put in a German school by well-meaning parents who thought it would be more familiar for her, who thought that she would be more at ease. But language is not a perfect match for ethnicity. Her fellow students, it turned out, mostly kids of Nazi families who had all fled after the war, during the war, refused to play with the Jewish girl. So the double trauma of her separation from her familiar place and relatives doubled up with the isolation in the school that retroactively explained the first one and marked the girl. So trauma, as one of the siblings says, frequently comes with a second trauma or never stops, a series of traumas. Edith grew up to be a prominent psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. And this is also often the case, that people who have suffered great trauma are interested in dealing with it and become psychiatrists. Now, watching the footage together, Andrea and I, and you just have to think that there were 60 hours of footage. You saw 52 minutes, but there were 60 hours of footage, and we watched it all. And we agreed that the deeper issue that came up was the Nazi past and the narrow escape. Rather than focusing on the migration of the siblings of Andrea's generation, the film cannot stay away, so to speak, from the consequences of that traumatic beginning, both in the tendency of the younger family members to migrate back to Europe, where they had never been before, and Edith's difficulty of relating, her psychotic crisis that she briefly talks about, and her inability to let go of her ambitions for her children. You see how she's pushing Andrea, why didn't you stay here to make films? She was trained as a filmmaker. Now for these, going abroad, it seemed, meant returning to, in some sense. So they went to Europe for the first time, migrated to Europe, but that was returning to their mother's country. And it also meant escaping a generation later from something that was confining, incomprehensible, and effectively damaging. Next slide, please. Most of the footage was filmed by Andrea herself, since obviously I was not part of the family reunion, of course. So, and even regardless of the long travel and expenses it would have entailed, my presence would have ruptured the intimacy. I only filmed the bits set in Amsterdam. So you see bits there, and that I did. But the editing is where you make a documentary. That's where you make it as a film. And this we did totally together. We had discussions, but never disagreements. Oh, yes, yes, yes. The work in the editing was entirely dialogic. And the film in the end has two features that you have seen that become meaningful in spite of being limitations if we consider the art of filmmaking artistically. First, we have not at all attempted to make the hard cuts in the footage of the interviews with Edith invisible. So you see these hard cuts. And the cuts make visible that the standardization of length required by the film business, it had to be 52 minutes to be allowed in the festivals and on television. They also show the inevitable incompleteness of what would otherwise be a deception. To pretend that this is a deception. Something that goes against the ethics of documentary, because one of the ethical aspects is that the audience has to be able to trust that this is the truth. This is what happened. Now, secondly, the film deploys a home video aesthetics. You see that moment when the mother says, why don't you show your face in the film? And then she changes the place, and all that we kept in. And that was due, of course, to Andrea's difficult triple function as camera operator and interviewer, as well as participant in the situation. And also the simple quality of the camera. This was a one-chip camera, the first one I bought. And this aesthetic, which again we have not attempted to soften, to eliminate, enhances an intimacy between image and spectator that compensates, if such a thing is possible, the troubled intimacy within the family, as well as my absence from the situation being documented. The spectator can thus become a participant, positioning themselves in the sense of bringing empathy and understanding to the situations encountered. And this touches on that contradictory need for intimacy and modesty that I have mentioned. Now, for my own position as co-author of the film, the primary question was, even before she went to Brazil, whose autobiography is this? Of course, I had to comply with her wish, with Andrea's wish, to make an autobiographical film, but also to not make it self-centered. And I was also not part of the auto, or so it seemed. At first, I completely sided with Andrea, trying to be her partner and assistant and help her express her frustrations and unhappy childhood memories. So I felt very sort of an assistant, which was fine. But then we were sitting side by side in the editing suite, after all, and determined to make the film together. And nevertheless, she is an immigrant and I'm not. So that's a huge gap between us. But here it becomes clear that migratory culture is a meaningful concept. As the film grew, I was hit by the recognition that I was more part of the situation than I factually could be. And how was that? I realized that in terms of my own life, in one important respect, the resemblance would be greater with Edith than with Andrea's life. As a young mother, I too had given priority to a professional career over full-time motherhood. And I had felt unable and unwilling to make the opposite choice and constantly resented the expectations to make such a binary choice in the first place. And I got a lot of criticism in my family that I went out to work. And that partial identification with Edith made for a bit of auto in Andrea cum Edith's autobiography. So it became an autobiography of the mother and the daughter, of which I was switching roles between the two. Yet the identification with Andrea was not replaced with that with Edith for very different reasons, but also due to the traumatic childhood of my own mother. I had had a bad relationship with my mother. Is there a problem? No?
Go ahead.
I was compelled to go through the emotions of frustration with Andrea, even as I was also drawn to Edith's inexpressible anxieties over her children's refusal to comply with her need to compensate through them what she had been deprived of. So I felt closer and closer to Edith without going away from Andrea. Can we have the next slide? Okay, so meanwhile, the tangled aspect of history, this is a historical photo of Edith with her children when they were small. History in the present comes in. History is in the present. For this film made more clearly and more explicitly than any of the other ones, demonstrates that underneath the compulsion to migrate, there is always a need, a desire, and a history. The children moved away because the mother had been taken away. Be it of the Holocaust, of colonialism, psychic damage is often paired with economic damage. And it acts up in migratory history. So all migrants have a history that is a problem. That acting up of history needs to be acknowledged more fully in our migratory culture if it is to become less anxiously polemical and defensive and thereby enabled to be more flexibly enriching, which it is, in fact. Now, how would our opinions be transformed when we begin to see the incoming novelties of an enrichment indeed? Just think about it. How often are we not mesmerized by the originality that comes with films from faraway cultural settings? What is called world music, for example. and artworks exhibited that show images, figurations, or situations that we would not have seen otherwise, and different habits of dress and hairdo. Next slide, please. Once I made a film, an installation, on the simple, tiny phenomenon of eating sunflower seeds in public space. Now, this habit, I know in Spain this is done a lot, but in Berlin, for example, this was completely novel. This habit has been imported by newcomers from countries where it is a normal way of sharing public space and scarce food. And this leads to dropping the shells on the sidewalk, which some people might consider dirty, but others a nice addition, visual and auditive, on the streets of a city like Berlin, formerly too neat in a boring way, and suddenly it becomes lively. This was really amazing. It entails the smell of the roasting of the seeds, the cracking of the shells under the shoes of the walkers, and in short, all 5 senses, and then the eating, all the senses are implicated. And most importantly, it has a triggering effect. It occasions, and this we have witnessed while we were making the film, it occasions people from the resident culture to speaking with the so-called newcomers about the meaning of this habit. Why are you doing this? Well, it's normal, right? Asking them questions. And in this film that we called Gloop Hearts, Gloop is the word for plural for hearts, but it's also the interior of the seats. This happens spontaneously. And the immigrants are the experts. So the Germans ask questions to the immigrants and they explain. And so the roles are reversed, which is beautiful. Consequently, in all sorts of ways, in small phenomena such as this eating habit, and in larger issues, the social fabric of what political scientist Chantal Mouffe calls the political can be improved. The political is not the political the politics of parties and tyrants, but the domain in which we all participate. And Mouffe's term indicates the social domain. The political is the social domain where disagreement and discussion lead to better understanding instead of to enmity, to animosity. Now, an important, frequently overlooked aspect that binds video and migratory culture together is time, temporality, rhythm, duration. And one such meeting point that raises uneasy questions about the cultural politics, the bond between culture and politics, is a phenomenon and resulting experience that characterizes both video and migration. And this is what can be called the politics of time. Video is the medium of our time, available to many, not to everyone, and put to different uses. It is also the medium of time, contrived, manipulated, and offered in different multi-layered ways. Migration is the situation of our time, although there has never been a world without migration. Suddenly it seems as if the whole world is on the move, or rather we tend to think that, but not as in mass tourism. In contrast to those freely undertaken trips, which with a return ticket, the movement is relentlessly urgent and goes in one direction only. And one example, I don't have an image of it, is William Kentridge's Shadow Procession, where you see all those cutout figures in black going from west to east, which is the opposite of what we expect, or what we have the prejudice that always happens, people coming from the east going west, but in Kentridge they come from west to east. Now, migration is also the experience of time as multiple. Now I'm getting to, is it okay? I'm coming to a topic that is theoretically, I think, for me is very important. Time as multiple heterogeneous, the time of haste and waiting, the time of movement and stagnation, the time of memory and of an unsettling present, not sustained by a predictable future. And in the catalog to the exhibition To Move that we published with Miguel Angel in 2007 or 8, I have called the phenomenon multi-temporality and the experience of it heterochrony. So the two aspects of the connection between documentary making and migratory culture, with their specific ethical and artistic issues, I would like to bring up for discussion. The one is what I briefly mentioned already, the necessity and the impossibility of knowledge gathering, expressed in the title of an earlier article that I wrote on the philosophy of documentary making as intimacy, modesty, silence, documentary making in the face of trauma. It's an impossibility. So how do we deal with the impossible that needs to be done? Now, I will end on that issue, but the other is related, but more general, the entangled relationship between image making and thinking. In a forthcoming book that I have titled Image Thinking, with a hyphen between the two nouns, between the two words, this is becoming, I discuss this as a more general concept, which is useful for many image making practices that do not explicitly address migration. So this is a more general issue. Now, the hyphen that connects image and thinking is crucial. The search is not for defining images as visually moving or as still images. The search is for something else. And this is the next slide. The question that W.J.T. Mitchell is really, his name is Tom, that he raises in the first chapter of his iconic book from 1986. That's an old book. It exists in Spanish, I think, called Iconology, Image, Text, Ideology, which discusses what is an image. The first chapter is called What is an Image? Now, it's not one he sought to answer, nor one that I seek to answer. And it shows this schema that I have reproduced from his 10th page, shows that a definitional question is not the point. His outline of the different maps of 5 families of images, graphic, optical, perceptual, mental, and verbal, each containing several subcategories. Now, so what is an image? Here you have it. And what can you say? Nothing. It shows that definitional statements are not the most enlightening. You have to be clear about your concepts, but not necessarily in definitions. Instead, they move in so many different directions that the futility of the attempt to pin down the word image to a single definition is totally obvious. Others have grappled with the traditional distinction between words and images that are as hard to sustain as they are to dismiss. And I've often had the reproach, the criticism that I was just, ignoring that difference. But I don't ignore it, but I don't make it an opposition. Alternatives have been proposed to bridge the gap between the two, such as most convincingly Lyotard and his concept of the figural. This was in his 1971 doctoral dissertation. Can we have that slide, please? He made this very clear, and the guy here on the left is Lyotard, and on the right is David Roderick, who is a great film scholar and philosopher who has written a book about it and explains it. And that's the first chapter of that book is very useful. And Lyotard turned language into a force, a movement, closer to the Freudian unconscious as laid out in the interpretations of dreams than to any socioderived structuralist conception of language, including especially force in the concept of language. Lyotard describes meaning or sense in terms that include affect, sensation, and intuition. And also spatially, force for Lyotard is inherent in language. It is, and this is the quote, nothing other than the energy that folds and wrinkles, I love that, wrinkles, the text and makes of it an aesthetic work, a difference that is a form. And if it expresses, it is because movement resides within it as a force that overturns the table of significations with a seism. that makes sense, like trembling, tremblement de terre. Now, I quote this passage from David Roderick's translation of Lyotard's statement in Roderick's very helpful explanation in the book of 2001, Reading the Figaro. And these words affiliate language with specifically cinematic language, based on the etymological sense of movement in the word cinematic, rather than any technical specificity. And this movement, of course, is very important. Now, for another solid explanation of the figure in relation to and distinction from figure and figurative within the context of art history and in its relationship to psychoanalysis and philosophy, there is a very good and useful article by Vlad Ionescu, and the reference is here on the bottom, where the author discusses the ideas of influential theorists of the image. Now, so if you want to understand the Figaro, these are the sources that you can best call on. All this matters a lot for my project, but in order to focus more precisely on image thinking, with the hyphen in the progressive form of thinking, and as a process, the media and the distinctions between them are not themselves central concerns. I made a video installation in 2019, again with the indispensable great help of my Murcianos friends, on Don Quixote. We have the next slide. And for that project, the formal discrepancies became predominant. Now, last year in the summer school, I spoke about this project, and it is all in my website with all the clips, so you can look it up and sit and spend evenings watching them. Now, my first imaging intuition suggested that in order to do justice to the peculiar, cyclic, perhaps even hysterical form of Cervantes' novel, when I first read it, I thought this is hysterical. And it's world famous, a masterpiece, hysterical. Now, while pursuing the two goals of showing and, oh, I lost an earring.
I'll get it.
Showing and or for witnessing, only an equally incoherent, episodic artwork could be effective. So we decided to make, not a film, because that would have to involve linearity. And you can't have linearity with Don Quixote. The novel is not linear. There is a pretense to linearity, but every day he goes back and he leaves again. So in order to be productive as image thinking, this artwork had to exceed a plain similarity of form. For that would be the risk of repetition, rehearsal, representation, the bad root of the word research as a search for something again. One reason I reject the term artistic research, which is so hot today, and elaborate image thinking as an alternative to it in that forthcoming book, is that problem of research, and then a lot of other problems. We can discuss this. Instead, and this is the heart of my argument here, it needs to yield thought images, or Denkbilder in German, created through image thinking. Image thinking leads to thought images. And under the impact of thinking as active, these provisional artistic theoretical results remain in process. That is why thinking suggests a continuity. Like the idea of theoretical fiction, which goes back to Freud's justification of the fictionality in his Totem and Taboo. It's so interesting how he defends that crazy text, this completely fictional situation, by saying this is theoretical fiction. So this concept has a long history. The fiction allowed him to elaborate a theoretical problem. And this is in fact what Miguel Angel Hernandez is doing with his novels, where he has a problem in the teaching to explain an issue, like the ethical issue of the work of Santiago Sierra. He couldn't explain it, so he wrote a novel, brilliant novel. So the thought image was a favorite literary philosophical genre of the group of writers of the pre-World War II Frankfurt School of Social Thought. And the short iconic texts Adorno, Benjamin, Krakauer, and others wrote were only texts, no images. So why did they call it thought images? What did the word bilder do there? And this brings in the issue of intermediality, which is of course totally crucial for filmmaking, requiring the distinction between media as a starting point, but not as an end point. And this is of course crucial in documentary. And when the people that inhabit the film happens to be migrants, likely to have different languages as their mother tongues, the method of translation becomes very important. But also the visual aspects, such as body language, facial expressions, that can be helpful in complementarity to the spoken words. And I have used this idea a lot in the documentaries on migration. Now, the next slide will show you the very famous, we have another problem. Walter Benjamin's very famous example. He was an avid art collector, and his image thinking in the invocation of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus in his thesis on the philosophy of history is legendary. Now you all know this image, even if the slide should be better, but what can we do? It's a good case where image thinking can meet and yield thought images. Now I trust you know this famous Klee image well enough to understand that in Benjamin's 9 out of 18 theses on the philosophy of history, he forges his thinking through this visual image. There we have it. A print from 1920. At the time of Benjamin's musings, this was a work of contemporary art. And Benjamin brings it to bear on not only the contemporary, and so this is nothing about migration, but about history. He brings it to bear on time as such, on the entanglement of past, present, and future. And this is not only presentation of a philosophy of history, but a reflection on time in process, with the said entanglement as the enduring result, ongoing. It distinguishes between past and future as before and after, so that the inexorable stretch of duration can reveal the piling up of the debris of catastrophe. This is what he calls it. Although he produced a verbal artifact, Benjamin, an allegory, he espoused the visuality of Klee's image. Now, together, Klee and Benjamin were able to show, not to tell, what the angel of history must look like. The success of this image thinking of the philosopher and the artist is not clarity, but an enriching confusion. So don't believe that what he writes is true in the image. Its face is turned towards the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, it sees a single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of its feet. The angel would like to tarry, awaken the dead, and reassemble what has been shattered, but a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in its wings. Do you see wings? With such violence that the angel can no longer close them. And this storm inexorably propels it into the future into which its back is turned, while the pile of debris before it grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. Now, it's an incredible text and an incredible image, but the connection is completely unclear. And the point of quoting Klee's and Benjamin's imagings in conjunction is not to prove that the latter is right with his interpretation of the image, because he's not. Visually, this seems rather far-fetched. But his goal was not a descriptive interpretation. Turning the image into an allegory, he severed the expected bond between image and meaning. nor is my point to allege the image as evidence of Benjamin's description of it. For it is not strictly a visually speaking interpretation. On the contrary, if it wasn't suggested by the work's title, it wouldn't be easy to see this as an angel. There are no clear wings visible at all. The creature, as I call it now, can just spread its arms and hands, and the few spots on the picture plane can hardly be called masses of debris, preventing the supposed angel from closing the wings. I'm sorry, I keep looking, but I don't see it. It might simply be measuring the length of some invisible item, like a piece of cloth, and if looked at with a cinematic eye, its eyes turned sideways seem to be addressing another creature or champ that we cannot see. Or these eyes may be trying to capture both the future and the past in one single look. Try it. An impossible task physically, but worth exploring in thought. Through the creation of thought images that imagine and image as a verb, the alternative to the hopeless failure of the never again idea. After the Holocaust, never again, and look at the world. And if we didn't know the title of the print, nor Benjamin's descriptive interpretation of it, the figure could be a coquettish woman in a short skirt and high heels, with an oversized head and her hair still in curls. It is the discrepancy rather than the similarity that demonstrates the visual linguistic interaction. So it's not the one about the other, it's an interaction. The encounter between the two images. Probably a shock to Clay, if less to Benjamin, this image has become an emblem, an icon on the left, as they call it in Germany. And that is where its status as Denkbild, as image, thought image, has been operative in the aftermath of Benjamin's comments, due to its activating effect on viewers or readers who participated in the thinking and who tried to make their own thought image in interaction with this image. Now, nevertheless, the noun icon, like icon of the left, stills the image, arresting it in a permanent meaning. And that stilling is, of course, both an opportunity and a problem. Now, can I have the next slide? Some more thoughts then on this thought image are called for then. Now, in the study of the genre, US-based scholar of comparative literature and German, I always give his title because otherwise we confuse him with the painter, Gerhard Richter, who's not the painter, begins his description of the genre with a whole range of negativities. Denkbilder are neither programmatic treatises nor objective manifestations of a historical spirit, neither fanciful fictions nor mere reflections of reality. And these negatives have something in common. Every category that is negated is inapplicable because it is one side of a binary opposition. So with using all these binary oppositions, he's also saying this is impossible. A programmatic treatise would be something like a political pamphlet, as opposed to historical objectifications. An opposition that audiovisual art, hence also documentary, is devoted to questioning. The second pair is equally subject to the reductions of binary opposition. What Richter disparagingly calls fanciful fiction stands opposed to an equally dismissed mere reflection of reality. And rather, and then we get a more positive tone, the miniatures of the Denkbild can be understood as conceptual engagements with the aesthetic and an aesthetic engagements with the conceptual hovering, I like that, hovering, between philosophical critique and aesthetic production. So now we get it, right? Now we come close to image thinking. Now I propose to take this statement as an important theoretical guideline. And this book is really worth reading. In line with the idea of image thinking, let's look more closely at the choice of words here. Let's take this as a figural rather than as just a verbal. Engagements brings us closer to the status of audiences as participants. Hovering recalls John Austin's use of the verb when in his groundbreaking book on how to do things with words, he is describing the ambiguity of fire. Fire as hovering between thing and event, which is a way of saying we cannot make these boundaries. Integrated with the Freudian concept of working through, I can also imagine a verb like weaving, mutually engaging on all levels. Moreover, I would like to recycle Austin's title as how to do things with images to account for the performativity of images, which is the ground of image thinking. In writing these pieces, Richter is discussing are miniatures, like Adorno's aphorisms, published as Minima Moralia, Reflections on Damaged Life, written between 1944 and 1946. They can also be short fragments, like the one, I love this one, Benjamin's reflection in a childhood memory on the ball of socks in the cupboard, where the package disappears as the content, the socks, unfold. And this is such a revealing instance of an impossible distinction. Now, some of the statements by the people in Unter Bajo Limpio can be seen as such thought images. And most of all, given the following part of Richter's definition, this resonates with Benjamin's fifth thesis on images of the past, which has been a guideline of my work all through between art history and anachronism. Every image of the past that is not recognized by the present as one of its own concerns threatens to disappear irretrievably. So the past is important, but if it is not brought into the present, it's gone. Now, this warning is crucial for our documentary projects. It is one of their main motors. The statement plays a key role in my most recent film, this one, It's About Time, Reflections on Urgency, which was actually in the Mucho Más Mayo festival in Cartagena this year. And there it is quoted by the figure of Aeneas when he enacts a student of Cassandra in a Benjamin look-alike costume. So he looks like Benjamin. But there was, I said, tomorrow you come as Benjamin. Okay, so he came with the glasses, the boots and everything. You can see this film, including a version with subtitles in Castellano in my website. It's the first film, it's only 31 minutes long and it's all about time and urgency. Now, next slide. In his most positive descriptive definition, Richter explains the thought image thus. The Denkbild encodes a poetic form of condensed epigrammatic writing in textual snapshots, flashing up as poignant meditations that typically fasten upon a seemingly peripheral detail or a marginal topic. Now, again, I would like to draw attention to the choice of words here as elements of image thinking, as a process rather than a result. The word flashes up suggests the quick flash that Benjamin urges us to preserve by means of recognition in the first sentence of that fifth thesis, from which I now quote a later sentence, quote, the true picture of the past flits by. Again, this flash. The past can be seized only as an image which flashes up at the instant when it can be recognized and is never seen again. So this repeats the idea of the previous quote. And this articulates why and how we were seeking in 2019 to revitalize Cervantes' novel for today, as well as earlier Flaubert's Madame Bovary in the project Madame B, a theoretical fiction as a critique of the hyper-capitalist exploitation of emotional need that is so powerful today, which I made with British artist Michelle Williams-Gamaker in 2013. We finished it. And also, it explains why I felt urged to revisit the writings of Descartes. In Don Quixote, We do it not in a linear film, but in video snapshots, or flashes in short, 8 minutes each. So you can just sit and look at one, maybe two, maybe three, and then next day you do more. Now, Richter's view also connects to the question of historical truth at issue in documentary, especially when it concerns people we don't know well enough. And this is one of the central topics of debate about fiction and its potential relevance for reality, and relevant for documentary as a genre. For knowledge requires the contribution of the imagination, which makes it impossible to be purist about documentary truth. Next slide, please. And in this regard, in his aesthetic theory, Adorno, I keep going back to Adorno because in spite of some of his judgments of value about music, he is one of the greatest philosophers. He never quits the relationship between reality and thinking. So what cannot be proved in the customary style and yet is compelling, that is to spur on the spontaneity and energy of thought, and without being taken literally, to strike sparks through a kind of intellectual short-circuiting that casts a sudden light on the familiar and perhaps sets it on fire. Now, just in one sentence, as in Benjamin's thesis, the language is again both visual and shock-oriented, with spurs, sparks, short-circuiting, sudden light, and sets it on fire. It's amazing in one sentence that he brings in all of those heavy, not heavy, but almost violent words. And this is thought alive. It's happening. This living thought is active, fast, risky. And the preposition re of the word research and representation is out of place here. The language, Adorno writes here, has agency and it is visual. In both respects, it is fast. In addition to the propositional content that advocates compelling as a serious contribution to knowledge, Adorno's wording makes the case that thought needs a formal innovation to work, an innovation that shocks, and thus it can gain new energy and life, involve people, and make thought a collective process rather than the kind of still images we call cliches. And our attempt to achieve such sparking innovation lays in the combination of material practices, changes of the mode of display, the anachronistic bond between present and past that you see constantly in separations, where the Edith's past comes back in the present of her children. The confusion of languages and other categories we tend to take for granted, and above all, the transmediation, the intermediality of the audio visualization of a literary masterpiece, of the literalizing translation in documentary. This is what we did in the project Nothing is Missing, where mothers of migrants speak to someone close to them. And we make literal translations when the speakers are entitled to be recognized with their accent, to be recognized that not the whole world is native speakers of English. And for example, there's a case in Mille un jour where he says, "Le temps le mange," time eats him. And we made that time ate him because he's talking about the past, but it's still an accented translation. Or the mother of one of the migrants who says, "When he left, my liver hurt." And liver, we would say my heart, right? But they say liver, fine. So we keep that because then you know that you're talking to someone who has a different background. But we still understand it. So in view of the need for witnessing, such a messy form of thinking enables and activates viewers to construct their own stories and connect them to what they have seen and seen around them, and connect to the social world with the imagination that is stimulated by fiction. Now, I would like to have one last issue. I'm nearly finished. These are two. I think they, yeah, well, we'll see. It's about documentary making in the face of trauma that you have seen as very relevant in the film. Now, the denkbeeld is in the form, and the form of the documentaries is experimental. And this is one of the questions that may come up when we talk about separations, is who is speaking when, and that's sort of, there is a sense of the arbitrary. As makers, we call the genre experimental documentaries. That's how we send them into festivals. And this experimental character, which includes both the fragmented style of Un Trabajo Limpio and the home movie aesthetic and the work with hard cuts of separations, makes it possible that a contemporary aesthetic can reach out to and touch a situation of long ago that, as befits the stilled temporality of trauma, persists in the present. In practical terms of cinematography, the main characteristics of the pieces and the entire installation as thought images are the effects of our image thinking, and this penetrates the forms, the materiality, and the affective effects. Now, if you allow me to use it as a transition to the issue of trauma, just a few details of the Don Quixote installation. And I'm doing this because I know you have access to it on my website. And some of you may have seen it in Murcia. There, long enduring shots predominate, and sound-wise, some are quiet, some are loud. And this allows the simultaneity, the proximity of different episodes, because they're all different episodes and they're all in the same room, without using the socially isolating headphones, which is something that I try to avoid. Another experimental form concerns the dynamic relationship between visibility and invisibility, image and writing. The actor Mathieu Montagnier, who is the spitting image of Don Quixote on the streets in Murcia, people said, hey, Don Quixote, he was just in his jeans and jacket, but he looks the part. The actor is visible, but so are sometimes the letters or inscriptions in association with other texts to foreground the nature of videography as a form of writing. The fragments from her book, read by psychoanalyst Françoise Davoine in Voice Off, next slide, break the realm of synchronization. No, the next one. I don't know what is wrong. Oh, sorry, no, keep this. I have, there are some problems with, no, this is.
So go back?
Back, yeah, back, still back. Okay, we just forget the, I have very little visual material also because trauma is such a delicate issue that you can't just put a slide of trauma on the screen. So the fragments from, there is, I was saying, there is a book by Françoise Davoine, and I thought I had an image of her, a French psychoanalyst of trauma, who wrote a book that we made a film about, based on, that breaks the realism of synchronization. So in the Don Quixote, you suddenly hear her voice reading something about trauma. Now, in short, through experimenting with possible forms of the art of video, we sought to invent, imagine, and image new forms for the formlessness of trauma. And the resulting disorderly installation embodies that form. Yeah, there she is. Hey. So this is Françoise Davoine. She plays her own role in the film, A Long History of Madness. And she wrote the book, and she was fabulous to work with. And so, and that's when I cited George Kubler, the Shape of Time, and Thomas McEvely, The Shape of Ancient Thoughts. Those two references are interesting for the idea of shaping and time. Yeah, there they are. Now, fortunately, defining, as I have said, is not the only or not even the best way of approaching and understanding something. Thinking through, engaging what one wishes to understand is a reciprocal intimacy that seems more promising because more open to novelty. And honestly, it was in the process of documentary making in migratory situations that the importance of experimenting of allowing the unexpected contributions by others or other events or other occurrences to stay in the films became clear to me. So there were moments that we did not eliminate an image that was not quite perfect, that was a little blurred or something, because it had that meaning in that moment. Now, much of the need to reconcile the two contradictory requirements of modesty and intimacy, both needed in documentary, has to do with the fact that many migrants have been traumatized, either by their past, like Edith in Separations, who became psychotic decades later, she had a psychotic crisis, or by the more recent events, such as hunger, fear, violence, that compelled them to leave behind everything, often including their families, which may have caused a secondary trauma. So to be adequately interacting with people in that situation, it is necessary to be aware of the issue of trauma. And as I have argued elsewhere, the term trauma has been so overused ever since the discussions of cultural memory in the 1990s, when Holocaust survivors and witnesses started to disappear. And so that was the end of the possibility of consulting eyewitnesses and documenting their statements. And that made a renewed examination of the issue of the Holocaust and the trauma it generated more urgent. But as often happens when an issue becomes hot, from that moment on, the term began to float around too frequently and easily to remain useful as a concept for understanding and analysis. And as a consequence, it has practically lost its meaning. Now, there is a chapter in this forthcoming book on image thinking, I think it's chapter 6, that is all about how to deal with trauma in terms of, in relation to representation, which is in a sense impossible. Now, the most likely situation when migrants suffer trauma is that of refugees. And therefore the issue of refugee-dom, as I call it, induces a serious rethinking of trauma. And for this, flattening of the concept is unacceptable, since it brings up a real and severe grave issue of today's cultural situation, in which refugee-dom is such a burning issue. We cannot ignore it. And yet the injunction of modesty forbids probing the people in the documentary to find out if, how, and why they have been traumatized. Moreover, and this requires special expertise of psychiatrists and psychoanalysts. So the contradiction between modesty and intimacy is thickened by the lack of expertise of the filmmakers, who don't know, and the subjects who cannot remember. And the unrepresentability of trauma, serious as it is, a seriousness that sits at the heart of this problem of modesty versus intimacy, might threaten to relegate it also to incurability. And that would be in accordance with Freud's view, actually, who is a special, who I will say a little more about this. But that is absolutely unacceptable, intolerable, because it means giving up on human beings. And therefore, in the Don Quixote project, as well as in others, especially the earlier made film and installation project, A Long History of Madness, of which you saw an image a moment ago, the attempt has been to present but not represent trauma. How can you present it without representing it? And we attempted to give it figuration. The figurations that don't infringe on the injunction of modesty, don't enforce an understanding of those who can only survive by efforts to forget, and cannot even reach the memory of what has happened to them and caused that trauma. And yet bring it to the awareness of those social interlocutors who might be able to stretch out a helping hand instead of turning their backs on the traumatized. And for this purpose, I've been thinking experimentally, in other words, attempting, essaying, making an essay, how to deal with the contradictory aspects of the trauma and documentary encounter. Now, first of all, to get some clarity about that starkly and darkly confused issue of unfathomable distress, We must distinguish between three aspects of trauma, and you see them here: the cause, the situation it causes, and the state of near powerlessness of witnesses, bystanders. And this is, I think, absolutely crucial to make that distinction and to see where you can stand and what you can do from that position. Okay, almost done. Are you still bearing?
Yes.
So hence my choice to briefly talk about an autobiographical documentary novel by Iranian journalist Behrouz Boughani. And that's the next, yes, there he is, who fled his country, Iran, where he was in danger of persecution, as journalists so frequently are. And he sought asylum in Australia, a country which we tend to take as a model of democracy and freedom. Alas, no. Instead of being welcomed as a refugee after a horrible sea journey and all sorts of things, as he had expected or at least hoped, without any legal formalities, he was imprisoned on Manus Island in the middle of the ocean. There was a detention center that was so scandalously illegal that it ended up being closed on the injunction of the Papua New Guinea government because it was totally illegal. Now, for Boughani, as a refugee turned prisoner, the traumatic situation of not knowing if and when his plight would end lasted, guess how long? 5 years. The same stretch of time suffered by Cervantes when he was in slavery in Algiers centuries ago. Now, I'm sure Boughani's book, if it doesn't exist in Castellano, it must be in production because it's translated in all the languages of the world. And if you haven't read it yet, do please. It's a bit of a miracle, this novel. It's not at all a novel, but it's 400 pages. It was written in short SMS messages, which the imprisoned author sent from a hidden phone from the prison. And the avoidance of recognizing trauma, even while avoiding asking people about it, is also important in respect to the role and attitude of witnesses. And in a traumatic situation, time itself breaks down. Heterochrony, here we have it again, becomes very serious, sometimes lethal as an affliction. And this temporal aspect is visible in this novel in the harrowing descriptions. And that's why I say it's barely a novel. Repetitive, elongated, and unbearably cruel of some situations. And another contradictory aspect comes to the fore, the utter loneliness of someone in captivity, along with, for example, in the chapter Queuing as Torture, of hundreds of prisoners under the burning sun. But every one of them is totally lonely. Witnessing with empathy such contradictory situations can contribute to overcoming, or rather attempting to overcome, the contradictory nature of binding refugees and other traumatized migrants to representation. And such works can also call upon the social interlocutors who are indispensable as witnesses and participants for the improvement of the social fabric of migratory culture within which refugees must be welcomed, to give them a second chance to a life that they are entitled to as being human rights. In the case of my video installation projects, this participant is the visitor, who is the primary addressee of the exhibitions. And its interlocutor and the interlocutor of the figures brought to life, whether fictional in the theoretical fictions or real as in the documentaries. And this is specifically effective in installations where different from theater films, the visitor is not alone, the gallery is not pitch dark, and the exhibition aims to activate visitors to become such empathic subjects that go towards the people. And the display is meant to have performativity in this specific sense, but sharing the different aspects. Boughani mentioned in a statement in an essay that follows the text of the novel, he says that the book is a play script for a theater performance that incorporates myth and folklore, religiosity and secularity, coloniality and militarism, torture and borders. We act out our ruminations. We embody our thinking. Argument is narrative. Theory is drama. And I think that's a beautiful statement of what is at stake really in this work. Now, of course, each artwork has its own performativity embedded in their respective media, situation, and temporality. And the potentially helpful interlocutor, we all, is the viewer for films and the reader for Bucani's novel. Both are hooked by the artworks to stay with the fear, to allude to Donna Haraway's book, Staying with the Trouble, that you probably know. Staying with the fear. But are these functions truly distinct between the reader and the viewer? And this is the reason why I try to bring this novel together with the films, not in an impossible comparison, but in the way the distinct media reach out, speak to each other, enriching both while respecting their differences. What I'm trying to suggest here is that they can also be made to perform in interaction, creating the beginning of a larger cultural ground on which to stand. This is a little, it's not the whole culture, but there's a little bit of culture that's more than one work. And that is perhaps something that can be growing like the ripples of small waves in water after a stone has been thrown into it. Now, this is what I think is important in migratory culture, is to see the smaller plots where things come together. Now, Françoise Darwan, who did this work on trauma, critiques Freud. She engages Freud. Freud said traumatized people cannot be helped analytically because they cannot do transference. And she said, well, let's shift the burden to where it belongs. The burden of proof, medical proof, is that the society has made these people mad. So society has the burden to help them. And so if your method doesn't quite help, she came up with the idea that there should be a little change. And maybe there is an image of the, I'm not sure there is. This is the quote that I just read. And this is this image I wanted to show. So this is an image in the Freud Museum in London, where you see Freud's iconic couch. And you know that the psychoanalytic patient was laying on the couch and the analyst was sitting behind it, so they wouldn't see each other in the face. And in Françoise Darwan's method, she does the opposite. She puts the analyst and the patient together on the couch, sitting or vis-a-vis, and it helps. She has enormous success in treating traumatized patients. Now, Cervantes had understood, as an experienced expert, the core aspects of trauma at the time that the term, the theory, and the attempts to cure it were not at all available. And one of those aspects is time. Not only is time stopped in its tracks, halted and stretched out, it is also frequently interrupted, but such interruptions do not restore the everyday experience of time. And another aspect of trauma is movement of the involved images of actions. And traumatized people, because they cannot even consciously recall the trauma-inducing violence, are also locked up alone within themselves. And Bucani reverts to that experience in his novel several times, that loneliness makes them vulnerable for the assaults of the trauma, which they cannot master by the narrativity of memory. And instead, these become a drama inflicted on them. The trauma assaults the patient as if from the outside. And that is so difficult to deal with. And this insight in trauma, you can see in a lot of older psychoanalytic texts. For example, from the French psychiatrist Pierre Janet, who was a contemporary of Freud, and they were together as interns in the Hospital Salpêtrière. And I have some references of that in the next slide. There are some sources, and I also have a list that I will show after this. I'm almost finished. Now, this Janet psychiatrist, he was not so interested in repression, but in dissociation, that doubling that is characteristic of the so-called schizophrenia, that the patients don't like that word, but that we talk about when we talk about people mad by trauma. Now, I think that in Bucani's novel, there is the concept of trauma comes up a few times explicitly, but mainly it consists of representations of what can only produce trauma, the cause. That can be shown, not the effect, the consequence. And so he writes, maybe you can do the next slide. I think there is one, yes. So here are these quotes from him. The collective trauma from the journey is in our veins. Each of those both odysseys founded in a new imagined nation. And then he proceeds to explain what the prison system does to rupture any attempt at community. In this context, the prison's greatest achievement might be the manipulation of feelings of hatred between one another. And this is why the prisoner is both alone and constantly crowded by others. But when he talks about himself, the word trauma does not occur. Instead, it is the multiplicity of personalities that is most striking. The schizophrenia figured by colors. And this I find is very important for the word and image figuration. I feel that I'm being taken over by multiple personalities. Sometimes blue thoughts parade through my head, and sometimes gray thoughts. Other times, my thoughts are colorblind. And that is like, you know, even the visual doesn't really help. So this is also a brief demonstration of the intermediality between literature and visual art. Now I'll leave it at this, and just the next slide, so that if you want to, while we talk, if you want to take some of these references, these are the most important references on trauma. I'm sorry I've kept you so long. I can't believe that you were so patient.
No, you stick to the time, actually.
Yeah, well, but I was hoping that there would be interruptions.
Now it's time for questions. Have to activate the camera. After the shutdown, it remained.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they can see us. So it's time for questions. Preguntas aquí en la sala o los que estáis conectados a través de Zoom, también podéis pedir la palabra o escribir vuestra pregunta en el chat. I have a first one about the narrative structure of separations.
Yes.
Because you mentioned that Un Trabajo Limpio was kind of fragmentary dialogue,
yes,
where everything was popping up in a more symphonic. But for separations, of course, you had to plan some kind of linearity, or at least some sort of plot, saving information for the midtime. This is one of the things that I like at the movie. I mean, that you discovered many things when you already have been introduced to the family. After 20 minutes, you start to understand things and heard about many things. So how did you work that with Andrea?
Yeah, that was the most exciting thing. We were sitting there, and I have to say, I made this film with Andrea 2 days a week, right? I was still working then. 2 days a week we did this, and the other 2 days I did another film with another filmmaker about contemporary Israel and the racism and all the problems there. And on Wednesday I did my own work. So Monday, Tuesday, I was with Benny, and Thursday, Friday with Andrea. And so we had 2 days a week. And every time we came back and we had been thinking, how do we go on? But of course, the issue of linearity is important because the film became completely different from what Andrea wanted to do. And of course, an autobiography, she could have started with the childhood photos and footage and then continue, but this was a completely different film. And I don't know if you saw the moment that Edith talks to Andrea about that nightmare she had. Mm-hmm. And you see that Andrea is sort of, she can't hold the camera still. So Edith almost moves out of the image because Andrea, this participant, but also camera operator, and is too emotional when she hears this nightmare. And that's why she moves out of and this was one of those things that I insisted we keep it. She said, well, but that's a bad image. I said, well, but this is exactly what's happening here. This is the autobiographical of both Edith and of Andrea as the camera, as doing the camera. And so I said, we have to keep this. And she agreed. In the end, we had never had a real conflict, but it was difficult for her to envision how to do this. And so we decided, I don't think we ever made it as a plan. We just did it in a way where each issue that came up led to the next issue. And so after being introduced to the people and the family members and the brothers who have a statement to make, it became one thing led to another. So it's not the linearity of the lives, it's not the linearity of the filming, it is just if you want to call it a linearity, because of course a film has linearity, it's the linearity of the associations that we had. And I think that is what is the power of the film also, in a sense, that there is no life history other than the few things that we get to know about Edith, and then later on about Orlando, the father, when he talks about his, another traumatic situation, the dictatorship. And so we were hopping from trauma to trauma, in a sense. And that is what binds these elements together.
And from a gender point of view, the order of the discourse was also important, no? Because of course Edith was the protagonist.
Yes.
And
But she wasn't supposed to be. Andrea didn't go to film her mother at all. She wanted to film her siblings and herself talking about migration. And Edith became the main character and the protagonist because that's where this whole traumatic situation started that may have led the siblings to leave. So yes, the order is important.
Mario, please.
Yes, I want to ask you about the preparations, about how do you think that this documentary affects the reconstruction of the family history right now? Because I'm thinking that they use footage, for example, that for them is very important to understand themselves. But if you have ethically thought about that, I'm thinking about the novel also, the novel El Order of the Mask, but Miguel Ángel Hernández, because he also thinks about this kind of thing.
Yeah. No, I must say that I was very impressed by that novel as a case of image thinking, of making an artwork as a way of discovering what really the problem was and why he could not just say Santiago Sierra is a bad artist because he's ethically doing things that are unacceptable, but not saying either this is okay to lock up migrants in cajas. So that novel for me was a real discovery of what you can do with fiction. But in the family, I've lost a little bit of touch with the family. In the beginning, we talked about it, and when the parents came or when Andrea went there, we talked about what had happened. And of course, for Edith, it was very strange that on the one hand, her psychotic crisis was in this film, in public. So that's overstepping the boundary of modesty in a way. But on the other hand, she got this award for Best Actress, which is a riot, of course. It's a complete joke. She got it. It was serious because she was so genuine. She was so true, so real. So in a sense, this was an award for her not acting, for her reality as a documentary subject. And so she was also proud of that. You know, now it's a long time ago, and the two little girls are now in high school. And Andrea got a job, so she did get a job in the film museum, which is great because all my films are in that museum in the archive, and so we have someone guarding it. But I don't know exactly, and I'm not sure I want to know, you know, how they are dealing with their lives now, because that would be another probing in the privacy of these people. And this is always the challenge for the documentaries. I tend to stay in touch. I cannot do that with all of them, but with some of them I stay in touch and I keep track of what happens. And then I feel that I'm asking too much sometimes. And I don't want to really know the details. And this is very difficult because the intimacy is also important. And so, yeah, it remains a tension. Let's put it that way. The modesty and the intimacy, the two cannot really be together, as trauma and representation cannot go together. So I have no answer to your question, really. It is, but for the audience, of course, because this film is still visible. If you want to see it, you can see it. Not on the internet, though. I have not put the documentaries on the internet, not in my own website, only fragments, because of this modesty issue. And but you know, it's possible to see it in exhibitions because that's a sort of a controlled environment where people are invited to be sympathetic, empathetic with the people, and then it is more likely that they get involved and committed to this culture, this migratory culture. So this is yeah, that's as far as an answer as I can give you.
More Nieves over there.
Yes. Mieke, when we were watching Separation, I was thinking, this is a very candid documentary in a way that I feel that I was inside with them. I have this real feeling of being with them. This documentary. So later you have explained all this relationship with modesty, trust, and intimacy. So for me, it has been very illustrative about that. But I wonder if it is possible, because you have said something fantastic about you have to be clear on concepts, but not necessarily on definitions.
Yes.
About this idea of migratory culture, because you also have said something absolutely beautiful, that is that it is in the small plots of a bigger narrative. So if you could expand a little more migratory culture.
Yes. Okay, so for me, it's really important that we don't talk about migrants as them, as the others. They're part of our culture. And that's why I said we have to talk about migratory culture, which is a culture where migration is just part of life. It's normal. There are migrants and there are non-migrants, but they have contact and they're in the same culture. And I think that is really important. And that's why I call it that. I don't want to talk about groups of people, because that's where you go into the othering, the us, them, and having judgments about others. And what do we know? And what can we know, and what do we want to know about why the hell would people leave behind everything that has been their life to go to another country? They must have a serious reason. And that reason is what we should be interested in, and not the fact that they have, I mean, in the sense of the psychological situation, what happens to people, like the Tarek, who was 22 and was suddenly, rejected by the French system. This is how it all started. I couldn't believe that this happened. And then he found, so we went out, we became real friends. He was my neighbor and I was like his big sister. And he said, I would like to marry someone so that I can have my papeles, my papers. Of course, that's no longer the case, that you automatically get that. But at that time, that was still possible. And so, and he's very handsome. And I said, I don't understand why you have trouble finding someone to marry you for the papers. And okay, he said, well, I'm really trying to do a mariage blanc, which is it's like the green card marriage, marriage for the papers, and then bye-bye. And so I said, okay, let's go out and I will observe you. So we went out on the town and I observed how he was talking to girls that he met, and and I said to him, and Tarek, you're a hopeless case. You'll never find someone. And he said, why? Because you like them too much. So nobody will believe that it's just for the papers. And that was actually a compliment to him, but also made it impossible for him to reach his goal. And then something happened that some uncle who was a friend of this other family said, my nephew would like to marry your daughter because he needs the papers. And then the parents said, ho, 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 our daughter makes her own choices. And they were brought together and they liked each other. And I had him on the phone every week since I had left Paris. And I said, what's happening? He said, I found someone and she wants to marry me. And I said, what's she like? Oh, she's very beautiful. I said, well, yeah, okay. But so what's the situation? And I wanted to check out that he wasn't being blackmailed, because that happens also a lot with these situations. You marry and then they say you never see her again, but you have to pay every month. And there's a lot of blackmail going on in that culture. And so I said, I want to see the family. So we rented a car, we drove to this other city, and I met the family. And they opened the door and I saw immediately, this is fine. This is wonderful. Great family, lovely, very loving and honest, and it was obvious. And so they decided to marry with my approval as the big sister. But no, the afternoon before the civil marriage, the police came in and said there is no marriage. No, the father went by the town hall and saw that the announcement of the marriage had been removed. So he went in and asked, and they said, no, there's no marriage because we don't trust it. We think it's a mariage blanc. This was ridiculous. And so he had to go underground, and she, the bride-to-be, appealed. She said, it's up to me to marry who I want and when. And she was very good and upset about this refusal. And so the appeal was granted. And so in the end, they could do it. But it was so hard and heartbreaking for Tarek to make his case. He said, I was afraid that my in-laws were going to not trust me. What does he have with the police? That sort of thing. And so this was the first attempt that I did. And for me, it has been important to be part of that migratory culture, in the sense that I was a guest at the wedding. I was dancing and I was having and singing and, with all the others. So I felt like privileged to be a guest in this party. And that was the other side of that migratory culture, when you get into a relationship with people with different backgrounds. instead of saying, oh, that's a migrant, you know, she's wearing a headscarf. This is, you know, there's always something. But look at the abuse and the violence within families in the so-called our culture. So I think it is really wrong to consider a culture homogeneous and to have to establish a boundary between others and us. And this is what my whole work, ever since that first adventure, my whole work has been about in the different projects I've been doing. And I'm very convinced that this migratory culture is what we should talk about, not about migrants and not about homogeneous white culture. There is no homogeneous white culture, as we all know. So we are all in a migratory culture. Have always been, will always be. Nothing wrong with that.
¿Alguna pregunta más desde aquí o desde allá? No hay preguntas en el chat, tú estás controlando. Macarena?
More than a question, I have a comment. No, thank you so much, Mieke. I was so impressed. It's just a round lecture, and I was remembering how you started with fashion, you know, how this is a passion that is going to drive you throughout the work.
Yes.
And I thought that's such an important point to put in this image thinking, you know, because this affect is pushing you forward in movement. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking on separations that all the time, I was thinking, what is this movie about? What is this movie about? Oh, it was inside of my head, you know?
Right.
This part of me, rational, was trying to pin down the topic. And I thought it was remarkable that I was moving from the migrant culture in a certain family, and then into the Holocaust, and then into motherhood, and then into, I don't know, feminist perspectives about work and kids, you know? Yeah. And then that's the very particular moment when the daughter says, it was so painful when you weren't, when I delivered my babies, you know? And then the mother said, but I wanted to go. You said no. And I thought that was so remarkable for me, because I could understand the Latin American culture of saying, you have to be there as mother, you know? And then I don't know, this new culture that separates things,
right?
You know? I could understand the Dutch culture that no, the mother should come, stay in a hotel, and visit 2 days afterwards I left the hospital. Where in the Latin American culture, you wouldn't go into a hospital without your mother, your son, you know? So I thought that it was such a beautiful process at the end, because I realized this image thinking was working out throughout the film, and it allowed me to explore so many thoughts and feelings, you know, throughout the topic in a way, or throughout the lives of these people.
Yeah.
And I thought that that's very wonderful way to address practice as research, because you said at the beginning that artistic research was not something interesting for you. And this image thinking is really a folder, you know, that you can open up. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That's a beautiful comment. And I'm glad you bring this up, because I have, in this forthcoming book, I write about it in the introduction, that artistic research, in addition to this sort of searching for what is already there, it's really the main problem I have with it is that it is applied to artists. In art schools, they have to become more intellectual.
Yes.
But how about intellectuals? Are they asked to be more creative?
Thank you.
I don't see it happen. And so it's a one-sided hierarchical relationship. Artists are not really serious if they don't get their PhDs. Well, I'm sorry, but my colleagues are not all so creative that they can stand up to that sort of creativity of the artist. It's even, I know this from experience of colleagues, that in the when there was a PhD in an art school, they had a lot of trouble finding a committee that was able to understand what this artist was doing with the artistic part of the work, right? And so then they said, well, they don't have enough writing. It's not 200 pages, it's only 100. And they should do more writing. Why? Look at what they have written with their art. Mm-hmm. And that's difficult because the colleagues in the academy don't get any training in dealing with art. And so they cannot be equals to the artists, which is why artistic research, as long as this is applied to the art students and that they have to have this intellectual thing and then the others don't, I reject it. And so image thinking is my attempt to bring the two into closer contact. Are there any questions from the outsiders?
Mario is monitorizing if there are no questions.
No?
¿No hay más? Última pregunta, ¿no? Ya hemos sobrepasado la 1:30, creo que es una buena hora para ir cerrando. Si no hay ninguna pregunta más, ok, pues cerramos aquí de nuevo dando las gracias a Mieke Bal por su presencia entre nosotros, por un seminario que ha puesto on the ground, on the field, many concepts and many suggestions and provocations on the basis of creation, on the basis of film thinking, image thinking, filmmaking, co-authoring. This is interesting as well.
Is important, yes.
It's important. We didn't have much time to talk about co-authoring, but separations is co-authoring.
Yes.
And you could perfectly,
Trabajo also, because that was done with Gary Ward, but there's also, in filmmaking, there's always other people participating. You cannot do it alone, impossible. Yeah. And that was the fulfilling thing for me when I started to do this collaboration, and it's constantly feeling that you get feedback and that you're being nurtured by this collaboration is very productive. I love that.
So thank you very much. Dank je wel. Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you all for your patience and your attention. I'm glad that you could stand it. It was too long, I know it is, but I always have too much. It's my sickness.
We see you next year.
I hope.
Yeah.